on loss and damage and child rights. This is organized by the Safety Nets and Resilient Families team and Save the Children. And we have many colleagues from all around the movement here with us today, as well as some external partners and external guests. And we look forward to this. Given that we have people joining from other regions, I would like to start by saying that you can turn on translations by turning on these captions. So I'll just give you a little bit of time to look at this. And the webinar will also be recorded, so just so you know. And next, you can also translate the PowerPoints that we will be showing today. This is how you do it. Great. So let me just introduce you to what we will be looking at today. So basically, this webinar is for us to get on the same page and for everyone to learn about what is loss and damage in the climate space. This is a space to ask all your questions. We will have a long Q&A, but we also want to hear a little bit about how this connects to child rights and specifically General Comment 26. And we have the honor of Elisa Morguera, the new UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights, joining us today to present on this issue. We'll also learn about Save the Children's advocacy position on loss and damage from our own Ida Strömsö. We have an external guest, a researcher, who will present his work on non-economic loss and damages and local level loss and damages to us. And then at the end, we have around 30 minutes for questions, and Jack Wakefield will close the webinar for us. So just to give you a little bit of background, this is part of a webinar series that we're holding this spring about climate change and children's rights. Last week, we had a webinar on climate and accountable services for children. Today, we have the one on loss and damage. And next week, there will be one on climate finance and child rights. And hopefully, we'll have other ones in the autumn about implementing General Comment 26, as well as child participation in climate. So you see that this is where our work in Save the Children on child rights and climate and environmental risks really comes together. It's an initiative that many technical working groups are supporting. We have the Climate Resilience and Environmental Sustainability Working Group, the Climate Crisis Advocacy Working Group that has been heavily involved in this one today, but also our child rights and child rights governance colleagues. So to start, we would like to ask you a few questions. And for that, I will stop sharing this before we say a few words about loss and damage and then continue on. Yes, let us know where you are based so that we know a little bit about your backgrounds. That's great to see. Lots of people from many places. And I'm sure many different experiences on this. So also to just say that if you have any experience working on these issues and you would like for other colleagues to hear about them, then just post them in the chat, because this is also a space for us to connect and become more aware of each other and what we're doing. So next, what comes to mind when you think of loss and damage and child rights? Please write your answer in the poll. We see many answers on climate justice. It's on violations. We see that it's a new concept. It affects schools, vulnerable children, destruction of crops, different places, remedies and compensation, rights restoration. But yeah, I like that children is there in the center, and that's really why we're having this webinar today, to show how is this relevant and important for our work with children. So I think we will be covering most of these issues today, and I think this shows that people are coming with lots of ideas and experiences already, but we hope you'll still be inspired. And I think we have one more question. Yeah. Just for us to get a bit of a sense of how much you already know about this issue before we dive in. Yeah, so far it's looking like a solid 2.6 right in the middle. That means that hopefully this will be useful to get us all to maybe a 4 or even a 3. And while people are still responding, I can hand over to Ida to give us a short introduction on the concept.
Yes, should I just go ahead while people are still filling in?
I think you can start, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Martina. My name is Ida Stromso, and I work as a climate advocacy advisor in Save the Children, both Save the Children International and also for Save the Children Norway. And I will talk a bit about now, just a couple of minutes, very briefly and overarching, introducing the concept of loss and damage. And then I will go through a bit more deep dive on what we think of as a child rights approach to loss and damage a bit later in the webinar. So loss and damage, for many, it's quite a new concept. For others that have been working in civil society for decades to get recognition of this concept, it's not as new because civil society have together alongside countries that are really affected by the consequences of climate change, fought to get recognition of the need for more finance for loss and damage for several decades, before we have now seen over the last just 2 years that we have major advancements when it comes to parties recognition as well in the UNFCCC and outside of the UNFCCC. So the term loss and damage, losses refer to things or elements, or can be more relational things that are lost permanently, while damages refers to things that can be restored after consequences of climate change. There is really no agreed upon definition, at least under the UN Climate Convention, but we see that we have more common understanding across civil society, academia, and member states, at least on some concepts under loss and damage. So we know that we have loss and damage happening quickly. That might be the most, or the things that come to mind first for many people when they think about loss and damage. For example, extreme weather events, when there is a flooding or there has been a hurricane, similar things, and all of the consequences that communities face as a result of these events, we look at as rapid onset loss and damage. But then sea level rise, for example, is an example of a slow onset event that is also considered to be loss and damage as a consequence of climate change. And then we have both economic loss and damage, That can be if you lose your house, for example, as a result of an extreme weather event. That's one that can also be non-economic, but there are very concrete consequences that can be counted into economic loss and damage. But then you have non-economic loss and damage, which we will also hear more about later in the webinar, or get some more deep dive into. Can be, for example, loss of cultural heritage, and there's many examples of what we can count as non-economic loss and damage. And in general, we look at compared to mitigation and adaptation, we look at loss and damage as the actions that go beyond what we can adapt to when it comes to the consequences of climate change. There's many different activities that can be counted as loss and damage. Still, I would say there is no full agreement on this yet, also because the loss and damage fund that has been set up has not really come far enough in their work to be part of the agenda setting for this topic. But we know that relocating communities, for example, that we have seen several examples of recently, rebuilding communities after extreme weather events, restoring nature after consequences of climate change, all of these activities are some of the things that can be considered loss and damage activities. And so just before I give the word back to Martina, where are we today with the policy development and the recognition of loss and damage in the UNFCCC? As many of you probably know, we got the new loss and damage fund, or an agreement that we were going to set up a new fund for loss and damage at COP27 in Egypt, which was a very historic event that civil society in many countries have been fighting for a long time, as I mentioned. After that fund, there was a committee called the Transitional Committee that worked for a year to propose the operationalization of this fund. So the decision on the operationalization was taken at COP28 in Dubai, and now the fund has a new board, and they have started working. So they have had one meeting and will soon have their next meeting, where they are developing guidelines. They are looking at what kind of projects they're going to fund. And right now, the discussions are mainly about how the World Bank, who's the host for the fund, are going to ensure direct access for communities, because they want to look at a part of the funding being given with direct access. And then they are also soon going to start talking about how to involve stakeholders in the decision, non-party stakeholders in the decision making of the fund. I will get a bit more into the details on this later, but yes, for Save the Children, I can just finally say loss and damage is one of the key violations of child rights in the context of climate change. And we see that children are increasingly being threatened by the consequences of climate change for their education, health, and many other aspects. So we'll also get deeper into this later, but therefore it has become a key priority for us to work on loss and damage. Thank you, Martina.
Thanks, Ida, for this brief introduction on the concept. And now I would like to welcome Elisa Morgere, the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights, to speak to us a little bit about how this relates to General Comment 26, access to remedies, and other issues. Over to you, Elisa. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'm very much looking forward to learning from all of you as well today. As you know, I've only started my position as UN Special Rapporteur on the 1st of May. So for the time being, and I've really been looking at how other UN Special Rapporteurs and also the treaty bodies under international human rights instruments have been engaging with loss and damage. And it's really been interesting to see already how much work and thinking has been going into this question. For instance, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development provided a definition of loss and damage as the negative impacts of climate change that occur despite adaptation and mitigation efforts. And also the independent expert on international solidarity has very much underscored how those negative impacts are experienced unequally. And I think these are, crucial elements for us thinking from the perspective of children's rights. Otherwise, there's been quite a lot of thinking about, well, what is the nature of loss and damage? What should we consider as loss and damage? And as you was already hinted at, maybe that distinction between economic and non-economic loss and damage doesn't really do justice to the indivisibility of human rights that are negatively impacted by those phenomena. My predecessor, the former Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights, Ian Fry, developed a report engaging with loss and damage, and he really emphasized the importance to focus on loss of life and human health, but also the loss of land and ocean territories and associated ecosystems, livelihoods, culture and cultural heritage, and in the most extreme cases, loss of sovereignty. And I think though that really captures the full range of the substantive content of children's human rights to a healthy environment, as well as the interaction between their human right to education, to play, to development that are interlinked with a healthy environment and with culture. This aspect, I think, of culture is really crucial, and there is a risk, I think, that it is underemphasized in the context of the Loss and Damage Fund. And so the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights has also really shone a light on the importance of understanding how climate change is already negatively impacting on cultural practices and artistic practices. And this has a knock-on effect on other human rights intrinsically linked with culture. And I think a children's rights lens is really important in that connection. Several treaty bodies have also started looking into concerns that we can relate to loss and damage, even if they have not necessarily used this language yet. So the Committee on Discrimination Against Women has been looking in instances of climate refugee women and girls. And the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has been looking at situation of climate-related food insecurity, destruction of property and loss of livelihoods due to the combination of floods, drought, and unprecedented rise in temperatures. So as I was saying, all these examples of loss and damage from a human rights perspective are very much crucial for protecting children's rights and in fact future generations' human rights as well. And I think it is important to again think about the indivisibility in terms of how children's rights to a healthy environment may be affected in ways that then will increase also negative impacts on their other human rights to life, health, survival and development, as well as adequate standard of living. And as a generalist human rights lawyer, I think what I find particularly powerful in the Convention on the Rights of the Child is that human right to development for children, which I think pushes the usual time frame that we take into account from an environmental and climate change perspective much further away into the future than we would normally do, and which is, I think, part of the problem in terms of the shortcomings in our mitigation and adaptation approaches. Now, it's very helpful that the General Comment 26 did address loss and damage specifically, and it did so both by recalling that in the Paris Agreement, parties have committed to address not only addressing loss and damage, but also averting and minimizing it. And I think that duty to prevent loss and damage is really crucial and shouldn't be lost sight in our conversation. The other, I think, interesting point made in General Comment 26 is the suggestion that loss and damage should be considered a third pillar of climate action, and it should be closely related to the human right to remedy and principles of reparations, including restitution, compensation, and rehabilitation. And this is, of course, a concern that has come up in other work of UN special procedures and treaty bodies. But I think it remains a very difficult one to address, because when we look at how the loss and damage fund, how it's been created and framed, we don't have references to averting or minimizing loss and damage. And we have a clear indication that the fund will not involve liability or compensation. And it's important to keep in mind that this limitation embedded in the loss and damage fund has been raised before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, who's been asked to provide an advisory opinion on states' obligations in relation to climate change. And I think that issue of particularly right to remedy will be very crucial in that opinion. And we might potentially expect that also the International Court of Justice might address this issue as well, maybe in broader terms of state responsibilities. So how does this link to children's right to justice? Again, I think the wording in the General Comment 26 is very helpful to navigate what's being discussed and agreed in the international climate change regime, but also what's happening around that regime. And the General Comment calls for states to provide access to justice pathways and opportunities for children to have access to complaint mechanisms that are child-friendly, gender-responsive, and disability-inclusive. And that includes quasi-judicial and non-judicial mechanisms. And I think that will be a clear entry point for discussing what safeguards are being discussed in relation to loss and damage, and whether there may be anything similar to a non-judicial mechanism to ensure compliance with those safeguards in the context of the operationalization of the fund. The General Comment also speaks in detail about appropriate reparation, including restitution, adequate compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition, both with regard to the environment and the children affected. And again, these have been questions that have been raised before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights during the hearings. I think there's some really important considerations, again, around rehabilitation, how it also relates to existing primary international obligations of states to protect biodiversity from climate change impacts, to rehabilitate degraded ecosystems. And, guarantees of non-repetition have also to do with existing primary obligations of environmental protection. And this is something that, for instance, very recently, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea has also clarified. It has indicated how existing obligations of states under the Law of the Sea already provide very clear content and indications in terms of where those obligations, how we can actually achieve that idea of rehabilitation and non-repetition on the basis of pre-existing and well-established obligations to protect, from prevent and minimize marine pollution, and climate change has been recognized as a form of marine pollution, but also protect and restore marine biodiversity. And again, I recall how these elements are part of how the substantive content on children's human right to a healthy environment has been clarified in the General Comment. I think another important aspect that the General Comment highlights, and I think that relates to, I think, the conversation today and future conversation, is that, of course, a meaningful remedy requires children being active participants in the identification of appropriate remedy, and of course also in assessing whether the implementation of that remedy is really protecting their rights. And I think these aspects of participation, which have been raised in relation to the structures that are being developed, that participation of stakeholders, but also the identification of priority for funding, development of safeguards, and the expertise that is needed, I think, in the structures around the loss and damage fund to make sure that children's rights are understood, that we can have safe and appropriate participation of children and their allies and organization that have the necessary expertise is a very big part of the questions that we have before us. So I'll stop there for now and look forward to other conversation.
Thank you very much for setting the scene and introducing these mechanisms that we are moving in. I also see that there are already some good questions in the chat, but I'd like to ask you to use the Q&A because it will be easier for us to respond to that later. And please also specify who the question is for, as we have so many great speakers. So now I'll hand back to Ida to give us a bit of an understanding of how Save the Children is working on this.
Thank you. I will just share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to run you through a bit of our positions and what we consider to be a child rights approach to loss and damage, as well as some of the advocacy efforts that are going on together with other partners and child rights organizations as well. So there we go. Just to start off, Elisa has already really well elaborated on several of the rights that we see are violated in the context of loss and damage, and also what the General Comment 26 touches upon. But I would just like to run through a few concrete examples as well, just so everyone has it fresh in mind before we dive into the policy solutions. So just to show you a few clips from our media team in Save the Children. First, we have the Bangladesh extreme heat closing schools, children losing education. There was also very recently 40,000 children losing their homes after heavy rains and flash floods in Afghanistan. Then droughts in the Philippines and floods in Kenya as well, taking children out of school, making them lose valuable education. And these 4 clips happened over the course of just a couple of weeks. So it's a really dramatic picture for children. And there's a huge need to really consider the unique consequences on children as well in the context of the loss and damage discussion. So also to put some numbers on it, this is a report that Save the Children produced a couple of years ago, showing that a child born in 2020 will, compared to their grandparents or someone born in 1960, experience 2 times more wildfires, almost 3 times more crop failures and floods, as well as droughts, and almost 7 times as many heat waves. So this is also why we need to have a child rights approach to loss and damage. I won't go very detailed into this because Elisa has really well elaborated on several of these, but this is just to show that there are a lot of rights in the Convention on the Rights of the Child that are most affected or very relevant in the context of the loss and damage discussion. So just to mention a few: right to education, right to health, also the right to cultural heritage and Indigenous peoples' knowledge, to protection, and of course to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. So to talk a bit about our stand and positions when it comes to what is needed for children in the context of loss and damage. This is a report that we launched at COP28 in Dubai together with good partners. We're very lucky in the child rights community that we are working very closely with other big international organizations and agencies. And for this report, this was a collaboration between UNICEF, Save the Children, Plan, the Loss and Damage Youth Collaboration, ICCAD, and the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative. So this is really a key document for our positions as an organization, as Save the Children, but also for the wider child rights community when it comes to what a loss and damage finance for children should look like. So I'm going to run you through now a bit of the content in this report so that we can all be well aware of the key recommendations that we have for policymakers. So the overarching recommendations are the following. So incorporating child rights as a guiding principle is one of it's the first step towards really seeing children recognized in loss and damage finance decisions, but also in the wider climate finance space. Also, I'm going to go deeper into what all of these entail, but just to run you through the overarching picture. Meaningfully engaging children in the process. Children have the right to be heard, and that also accounts for the processes on decision-making on loss and damage. That includes also in the design and monitoring and implementation of projects or finance flows that will come from the new loss and damage fund and wider loss and damage financing. The new loss and damage finance arrangements, either if it's in the fund or outside, also need to take into account children's particular needs and unique vulnerabilities. We need to ensure access to funding for children and their families. And we need to ensure accountability and access to justice for children, as has already been touched upon. Finally, a key category of recommendations is that we need to really invest in children. And this also includes rebuilding and recovering children's critical services, such as education, health, nutrition, social protection, and child protection. So going a bit deeper into what all of these recommendations entail. So this is a picture of the first meeting of the board of the new fund for responding to loss and damage. And a lot of the recommendations are tailored towards the new fund because it's the biggest finance mechanism that we now have for financing loss and damage. But of course, this also accounts for wider sources and funding arrangements. Member states have been talking about the loss and damage finance as a mosaic or a kind of an architecture of a wide range of funding arrangements. What the other funding arrangements look like, we have seen a few examples hosted by specific countries, but it's still a bit unclear what this mosaic of solutions will look like. So that's also one reason for focusing specifically on the loss and damage fund. So children, to incorporate child rights as a guiding principle, we need to see children and their rights explicitly referenced in the governing instrument for the fund, in the accountability mechanisms, and in the guidelines of the new loss and damage fund. And this is to ensure that when planning for financing and projects, we need their specific needs, also those of caregivers, factor into the design of the project proposals. Also, all proposed loss and damage finance mechanisms, policies, budgets, and administrative decisions should undergo child rights impacts assessments. And this is also from the Convention on the Rights of the Child to really figure out what the best interest of the child is, as they have the right to. You need to do impact assessments to look at what the consequences of a project will be, or of actions or policy making. Yes. Then going to the next point that I mentioned. So to meaningfully engage children in the process, that entails, among other things, that children and locally led organizations, also child-led organizations, should be recognized as active participants in decision-making on loss and damage. And that is particularly relevant now because coming up in the next board meeting, they will start discussing how how non-party stakeholders are going to be recognized as active participants and be consulted in the process of developing the fund. And children should be included as experts in their own right in the processes related also to the design and implementation of the projects under the Loss and Damage Fund. Also when it comes to monitoring, evaluation and learning. So the next bucket of recommendations is taking account of children's particular needs and unique vulnerabilities. Also just want to stress that we have more recommendations than I will present today, but this is just a selection of the most important ones. So to really take account of children's particular needs and unique vulnerabilities, we have to have loss and damage needs assessments that are considering existing and intersecting vulnerabilities. And examples when it comes to child rights approach can be child poverty and inequality for children and between different groups of children and families, and also their capacities. We also need to focus on disaggregated data, which is really key in developing this new system of loss and damage response. So it must be informed by disaggregated data, which is at the minimum broken down by age, gender, and migration status and disability status. And a key bit as well is to ensure access to funding for children and their families. So this means that children on the front line of the climate crisis, including child and girl-led organizations, they need to have timely access and to financial support through the fund and other finance mechanisms. And this report came before the decision on the fund was taken, so we advocated for a dedicated community window. How this will look like exactly is still a bit unclear, but now they are negotiating or discussing with the World Bank how they can ensure direct access of some of the funds to communities, as I mentioned. So we will see how that develops further and how that can support children. We also need technical support to really ensure that the climate finance is child responsive. So really delivering and taking into consideration children's needs in loss and damage finance. And in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, it's really key that we provide accessible funding to local actors in ways that generally support them and don't ensure that any more risk is affecting them than before. And to ensure accountability and access to justice for children, of course, also a very key one. So children and children's organizations must have access to effective grievance mechanisms and remedies if the activities of the Loss and Damage Fund or other funding mechanisms violate children's rights. That, of course, goes for all human rights and livelihoods and the environmental integrity of their communities. And we also need to see effective environmental and social safeguards to ensure justice for children and their families under the Loss and Damage Fund, but also other funding arrangements. The final category of recommendations that we consider to constitute a child rights approach to loss and damage is investing in children. So we see that significant sums of finance for loss and damage, and that goes for all climate finance, should be directed at child critical social services. And that includes health, for example, services, the climate resilience and reconstruction and recovery of health services, of education. I showed many examples of how children are deprived of their education in extreme weather events and also in other climate extremes. Food, nutrition, clean energy, WASH, and also child and social protective services. And loss and damage funding should be provided directly to children and communities displaced by climate-related extreme events as well. And just to wrap up the recommendations bit, to achieve these ambitions, we really see that the Loss and Damage Fund and Loss and Damage Finance must follow a key set of principles, and this is very in line with wider asks from civil society. So we need to have integrated financing that breaks down silos. So we don't want new loss and damage finance to exist on its own. Of course, we recognize that it overlaps to some extent, for example, with anticipatory action finance and humanitarian finance. So we need to see how it can complement these finance flows instead of creating more silos. It needs to be sustainable, equitable, and debt-free support, so primarily given in the form of grants, and to address vulnerability and building long-term resilience of communities and children as well. So before I wrap up, I also just want to talk a bit about how we have worked as a child rights coalition together with our partners on advocacy on loss and damage and loss and damage finance for children. So before COP27 in Egypt, when we had the big decision on the Loss and Damage Fund, we really worked to echo and support and strengthen the wider civil society pressure on getting the fund in itself before we started getting specific on what it needs to look like. And then we have seen 2 Glasgow dialogues since then. The Glasgow dialogue has been a mandated space in the UNFCCC for countries to discuss loss and damage finance before the fund was set up. It was a key negotiation arena for this as well. And this year in Bonn, just 2 weeks ago, the 3rd Glasgow dialogue happened, where it was mainly informing now the existing institutions or mechanisms on loss and damage, including the new fund. And here we advocated strongly that children needs to get a key place in the center of the fund, getting targeted by finance, and for the rest of the recommendations I have mentioned, in front of the co-chair of the new fund, as well as other key stakeholders. We also worked last year really to influence the transitional committee that was going to set up the Loss and Damage Fund. And then we saw at COP28 that we got a fund decision that recognized the need to consider children and also to target children with finance. And I will show these specific formulations after. So that was a very important win. But there's still a lot of work to be done to really see what does this mean in practice, what kind of implications will it have for the guidelines of the fund, and what kind of projects the fund is going to finance. So now the main focus, at least of Save the Children, is to work towards the board members and the co-chairs of the Loss and Damage Fund to really influence the new guidelines for the fund, that we get proper safeguards, as I mentioned, and more of the recommendations that we want to see go through. So here are the formulations from the Loss and Damage Fund decision from COP28. Where it says that parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the right to health, and the rights of indigenous peoples. And then they mention several groups, including children, and also to take into account intergenerational equity. So that was an important formulation for us. And then it also says, as I mentioned, that a wide variety of sources should be made available to support and complement the new and existing arrangements, including to target people and communities in climate vulnerable situations, which of course include women, children, youth, indigenous peoples, and many other groups. And then finally, a key kind of arena where we need to see loss and damage more recognized now as well is the negotiations on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, which is the new climate finance goal that will replace the 100 billion goal that we have had up until now. And there currently a lot of rich countries are very hesitant to recognize loss and damage as a third pillar of climate finance, and to have specific allocations or signals on how much loss and damage finance we should see. So now it's almost a new round of fighting for the recognition of loss and damage into this new climate finance goal, where civil society alongside countries that are really affected by climate change are again fighting to see countries recognize the importance of loss and damage as a separate category. So that will also be a key piece of work going forward on this agenda. And if you have any questions about the work of Save the Children on loss and damage, can either contact me or Jack, who will speak a bit later today. We work as a global climate advocacy leads for Save the Children. And then I will hand the word back to Martina. Thanks.
Thank you, Ida. This was great, and I look forward to now diving into more like what happens in the field and to learn from the research from Dove van Schie, and I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Bonn and a researcher at the United Nations University.
Yes, I'm just sharing my screen.
Great, we can see it.
Yeah, you can see it?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, then I'll start. Yeah, so my name is Douwe. I'm currently doing my PhD at the University of Bonn and also working as a researcher at UNU-EHS, which is United Nations University. And the last few years, I did research on kind of the lived experiences of non-economic losses and damages in different regions in Bangladesh. And that's what I'll mostly be presenting on today. So I'll first quickly go into kind of defining non-economic losses and damages quickly again. I mean, we already talked about it a little bit today, but I'll go into it a little bit deeper. And then I'll show 2 case studies with some evidence from the in situ research that we did. So defining non-economic loss and damage. So the concept of non-economic loss and damage, and I can imagine that for some of you who haven't heard the term, that the term non-economic might be a bit strange, but it's kind of seen as the remainder of items that are not economic items. That is to say, non-economic items are those that are not commonly traded in markets. And this is from a UNFCCC report from a technical report from 2013. And that's kind of when this concept of non-economic loss and damage entered the loss and damage space. And what the UNFCCC kind of refers to with this is, okay, you have economic losses, which is things you can value, such as infrastructure and property. You also have non-economic losses and damages, such as health, human mobility, territory, cultural heritage. So they really dichotomize, the two. So there's many conceptualizations of what kind of non-economic loss and damage can be. As you see here, this is the UNFCCC in 2013. So they say loss of life, health. Then other people also added, for example, education, social bonds and relations. Other people talk about indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. And I also, you'll see in the first case study we did, we also kind of try to typologize what non-economic losses and damages mean, but it kind of shows that while the UNFCCC once has made a categorization, it's not necessarily, very, very set what non-economic loss and damage exactly is. So I'll skip these to speed a little bit up. But the first case study. So the first time we did this non-economic loss and damage research in Bangladesh, we looked at autonomous responses to non-economic losses and damages, and that is kind of first looking at, okay, from how do people experience loss and damage, and then how do they actually themselves already respond to this. What we did is we first selected these 10 categories of non-economic loss and damage. Then we assessed the losses and damages within those categories. And then we assessed kind of these autonomous responses that people had to them. We did this in the southwest of Bangladesh, which is quite a research-intensive region. So if you want to read up on loss and damage, a lot of the literature actually comes from here. So that's where we did this first study. Yeah, And people there, they experience cyclones, riverbank erosions, flooding, salinity intrusion, temperature increase, precipitation variability, all kind of at the same times at different times of the year. So it's really a confluence of hazards that we are looking then at. So I'll quickly overview some of the examples that we saw there, and then also the autonomous responses, maybe so it gives you a better overview of, okay, how do people experience non-economic losses and damages? So, for example, we're talking about increased diseases and sickness. For example, after a flood, when water stays within an area and you have kind of this water logging, which leads to waterborne diseases. But also salinity intrusion, so the rise of salinity levels in regions can contaminate water that people then have to drink, or can lead to skin diseases, for example. In response, people talk about herbal treatments, medical storing and using medicines, and going to the doctors, which then also adds expenses again. Salinity intrusion can also lead to the damage or the loss of hair. So a lot of people there in Bangladesh, they face hair problems, which means that the hair becomes very brittle, or actually they completely lose the hair. In response, they use henna. Some people completely decide to shave it off. They buy more shampoo, which seems very insignificant. But if you're already living on a poverty line or below a poverty line, then this also just adds to expenses and also just acceptance at some point. Another one is the decreased ability of growing culturally relevant flower. For example, the Hindu populations in Bangladesh use a lot of flowers for the puja, the ritual of sacrifice. But now, due to the salinity intrusion, but also, for example, the drought, also flooding can destroy those flowers, which means that they cannot really practice religion how they used to, which then can be sort of mitigated by increased fertilizer usage or having to buy them at markets. And again, adds costs here. I am looking also, I realized we're having a Save the Children webinar, so I try to look for my data that also talks about young people in some sense. And we had some conversations with people that talked about, for example, the skin disease and pigmentation increase that come with the exposure to sun, but also salinity intrusion means, how can I say this best? That it's harder to marry of girls because, like, of course, you have to have like a perfect skin and be married. So what people now kind of do is they said they keep the girls inside more, so they're not working in the fields anymore because that exposes them to salinity, or it can also lead to earlier child marriage. So these are some of the examples that we saw. And then to go a little bit more specific into these kind of children-specific non-economic losses and damages that at least we saw, is this susceptibility to disease and sickness, this heightened susceptibility, the loss of education that they face. So either schools are destroyed or everything is flooded, so you cannot go to school. But also more fatalities after cyclones. We had one participant who said after cyclone Ayla, which is, I believe, 2009, it was almost like there were no kids and no old people in this area. So
David, just to say that you have until 5 past, so you can take a little bit of time because I feel that you're rushing a bit. So no worries.
Yeah, you'll have no idea how many slides I have.
Okay, then go on.
Yeah, no, okay, but thank you. So the conclusions of this case study is basically to show the context dependency of non-economic losses and damages. The people, the Hindu people, they face these specific losses and damages to these flowers because they have this particular religion, which you may not have in a different region. There's a lot of complications around valuation, which is very characteristic of non-economic loss and damage. So, for example, even the loss of going to school or health, like how do you value this? Often when we talk about these international fora, we talk about mobilizing trillions of dollars or euros, but how do you actually value such a thing? We saw the social inequalities that shape non-economic losses and damages. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next case study. And I think what's most important is we looked at these autonomous responses and we really felt that people were coping. They were not adapting. So they were not preparing themselves and they couldn't completely alleviate their losses. But what they had to do is kind of in the face of emergency, even though they already had no funds, spend extra funds on medicine, spend extra funds on maybe school books that are lost, for example. This study, and I'll go a little bit more into kind of the conceptualization research side here, but we also found a lot of issues kind of with non-economic loss and damage assessments and kind of how non-economic loss and damages is conceptualized. So we found that kind of we had this very top-down framing, right? Like we use these categories and then we use these categories to assess what people experience. But that people at the UN at some point in 2013 made this kind of categorization of non-economic loss and damage doesn't mean that is actually what people experience. They have no real say in kind of what is assessed. Also, we felt we were really compartmentalizing these different losses and damages. I think it's, again, really easy to make a very rigid policy framework. But there's the boundaries and linear understandings can be unhelpful for kind of disentangling these complex and messy concepts. And then the dichotomization in general. So often and also within the negotiation sphere, for example, you'll see people talking about economic and non-economic loss and damage, but in how far can you completely dichotomize these two? And these four is a little bit what I'll talk about in the next case study. So the next case study takes place in North Central Bangladesh, and we talk there about centering local values in loss and damage assessments. So instead of having kind of this rigid categorization of what non-economic loss and damage is, we first had conversations on what people value most. So what do you do in a day? Why do you live where you live? We then, with participants, identified 10 values, what they think is most important and how they define them. And then we assess losses and damages related to each value. And I realized I don't put it on the slide, but we also then looked, okay, so how can we address those losses and damages? So that's kind of the fourth step that I should have added here. So this is North Central Bangladesh, just for your, so you can see. So first we did the research here in the southwest, and now we went to the north. And we first sat down with people and we kind of talked about the climate-related hazards they experience. So I think it's good to mention that loss and damage is an impact, like flood impacts and floods have always existed in Bangladesh. The reason why now we call it loss and damage is because floods are exacerbated by climate change. So we try to kind of see the history of floods and other hazards in Bangladesh. So this is 1998. And then here you have 2002. And then we ask them, okay, so which floods did you experience and when do they happen, for example? So here you see that they identified a lot of hazards that have been kind of increasing over the years. Of course, there's some recency bias. But for example, they said droughts, we hadn't seen them before. And the heat that we're now facing, we haven't seen before. Also, the flood that they faced in 2022 was not a flood that they had seen before at that scale. And I have, so yeah, like people said, we have not seen a flood like this in 50 to 100 years. And we first got affected by droughts in 2018. And since they occurred in 2019, 20, and 2021. And it has been increasing day by day. So that's how we kind of looked at the climate change aspects of all of this. Also, the way or the time of rain has changed. Like when it starts raining, it rains for a couple of weeks. When it didn't rain, it remains dry for several weeks. So this is how we talk with people about these hazards and how their lives has changed. So I'll quickly show these values. So this was our new framework. You'll see it coincides with the other framework a little bit. But we talked about development, education, health, nature, religion, culture, society, family, serenity, and mental health. So this is what we defined with participants. I'll share a paper after where you can see this exact process. Instead of me talking, I would like to show a video. I think it's about 2 minutes, and I'll hope it works, that you can hear the sound. But yeah, this is Sharifa, and Sharifa will talk about her kind of and her family losing livestock during the flood of 2022. So I think...
বন্যার প্রভাব অনেক বেশি হয়েছে। আপনার বন্যার সময় আমি আপনার আরেকবার চৈত্র ফাল্গুন মাসে মনে করেন 60,000 টাকা ঋণ নিয়েছিলাম ডেক্সের থেকে না একটি কামার থেকে না হেরে পুরোটা আমি মাছের চাষ করছিলাম। এর 2 বছর আগেও মাছ ছিল। পরে এই টাকাটা যদি উপার্জন হয় বেশি হয় তাহলে ফুলাখানে লেখাপড়ার কষ্টটা আমরা এন থেকে বাইরেবো আর ঋণের সুদটাও বাইরে যাবো গা দিকে ফালাই দিই কিস্তি কাজ কাম করে আস্তে আস্তে চালাই এমনি। তখন দেখা গেল ভাই বন্যা বাসায় হয়ে গেছে না। আর আমার 6টা ছাগল ছিল, এই ছাগল দিয়ে আমি কি করতে রাখতে পারি না। এর ধান জমি সব মনে করেন যে ধান জমি লাগাইলে তো আর ছাগল পারার মতো সুযোগ নাই। আমি ছাগল দিয়ে বেচা মানে আশের কামার দিতে চাইছিলাম। 63টা আশের বাচ্চা এই যে এখন দেখছেন না, সেই আসতে থাকলে কিন্তু হয়েছে এখন ডিম দিল হইলে একটু দিক দিয়ে পানি হয়েছে মনে করেন 63টা আসামা নিয়ে গেছে ডলে বাসায় মুরগি মনে করেন 4-5টা বাচ্চা হলো মুরগি নষ্ট হয়েছে এনকে পুকুরে মাছ গেছে গা হের বাপের মেয়েটা কিন্তু হের বাপের যদি একটু চিন্তাযুক্ত হয়ে যাতে আমার মেয়েটা কিন্তু অসুস্থ হয়ে যায় হের বাপের টেনশন দেখে যত টেহারিন বাইয়ের সামনে পরীক্ষা আমরা 2 টাকা দেওয়ার মতো এরকম মানুষ নাই আমার বাপের বাড়ি কিন্তু গরিব আর জামার গোষ্ঠী যা দেখতে সবাই বাড়ির মধ্যে সবাই গরিব মনোরঞ্জন কারো কাছ থেকে যে কেউ 2 টাকা ধার করবো এরকম মানুষ নেই কেমনে কি হবো আমরা কেমনে আগায়াম আমার বাপ আমার মা যে এত বুদ্ধি করে এদিকে মাছ চাললো আমার মা কষ্ট করে সারাদিন বাড়িতে যে জিনিসপত্র ফালে এদিকে আশা ভরসা আমরা লিয়া সবই গেল তখন আমরা কিভাবে আগায়াম এরকম আমি আমার মেয়েদের চিন্তাযুক্ত বেশি আর কি এরকম অসুস্থ হয়েছিল আমার মেয়েদেরও চালান লেখানি লাগবে বাপ মেয়ে দুজন
এখানে আপনি কত
Yeah, so this is an example of how people, like a story of how people experience losses and damages, and also how these losses and damages intersect and kind of cascade into each other. So Sharifa, she talks here about the floods, what leads to the loss of livestock, which leads to loss of income, which leads to stress and mental health struggles, which then has impact on her family, for example. There are many examples of how this can kind of work, and I'm showing this to show these kind of cascading impacts of loss and damage. For example, a drought can lead to the loss of trees, which then loses the production of fruits, and these fruits you might need for a ritual, and also can lead to great mental health stress or mental stress, because you cannot fully exercise your religious practices. Another one is temperature, which can lead to impact on health, which might make you unable to work, which then again reduces your income, which can lead to stress as well. A fourth one is erosion, riverbank erosion. We saw in the village in the north central Bangladesh how they lost a Hindu temple there, and what that meant basically was that then after the Hindu community lost their temple, a lot of them moved away to a different space, to a space where they actually had access to a temple. Which made the Hindu population a minority in this space, which led to social marginalization by other religious groups, which then also leads to stress/mental health. What is maybe good to see here is kind of, okay, what do we then mean with non-economic, right? I mean, this can all be kind of categorized as non-economic losses and damages if we look at the UNFCCC definition. But for example, livestock, like a cow, you can sell it on a market for a certain price, but also it holds great religious value, for example, in Hinduism. The same with a temple, like it's made of stones, like you can economically evaluate it to some kind of sense. But also beyond this, it has way more cultural and religious value. It also shows how economic loss and damage can cascade into non-economic loss and damage. For example, income might lead to stress, and also health issues, which are then non-economic, can lead to income loss, which is then kind of economic. So it's basically to show this complexity in this dichotomy, and that it's quite complicated when you actually look at the lived experiences of loss and damage. I also quickly thought I actually have been thinking about this in a different research where we look at loss and damage and urban informality. So it's not necessarily part of this project, but also if you, for example, now look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they talk there about the right to education, the right to standard of living adequate for health and well-being, including food, clothing, housing, medical care. And these are all losses and damages that are seen in empirical studies. So there is, in some sense, an intersection between losses and damages, and in some sense, human rights violations. So we also rank losses and damages. Now immediately go to these ones. So we also talk about people, okay, what do you think has been most impacted and what do you feel is most important to you? So that's what you see here on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, what is most impacted? So for example, people felt that family was very important, but not very impacted. But for example, mental health was less important, but very impacted. And then nature and development, very important, very impacted. We have disaggregated this data along various demographic information. What's maybe interesting if you look at age is that there's mostly a big significant outcome here in education. where younger people really value education more and see it to be impacted so much more than this kind of older generation. My last part of this presentation is about addressing loss and damage. So how do we actually address especially non-economic loss and damage? This is not from my paper, but by a paper from Karen McNamara and colleagues. And they talk about education and training to deal with non-economic loss, also documentaries and movies, strong relationship with land and sea. And we did a similar approach where we asked people, okay, so what do you need to address these losses and damages? And then we had, I think it's 22 different responses that people said multiple times. And we also ranked these within a survey. So we asked, okay, from 1 to 5, what do you actually perceive to be most useful? So what we discovered here is there were actually very little things that they mentioned that directly related to non-economic loss and damage. So for example, replanting trees, mental health support, rebuilding religious sites is very easy to directly relate to non-economic loss and damage. Another one is compensation. So cash transfers is often talked about in this sphere, but was not deemed relatively super useful by participants. Another observation that we made is that a lot of times people just talked about adaptations, while we conceptualize loss and damage as beyond adaptation, but still people talked about early warning systems, shelters, and embankments. And another one is that a lot of things that people mentioned also coincided with what we see as general development. So a stable electricity supply, job opportunities, improve the roads and the clinics and the hospitals. So these are some of the the patterns that we saw in these responses. And I think an interesting lesson from this is to see that addressing loss and damage is not necessarily anything new. It's a lot of things that we're already doing, but just because we face climate change now, they are more needed, more urgent, or needed at a bigger scale, for example. So conclusion of this is, again, there's thousands of ways to experience loss and damage, and many are complicated to assess and value and also to kind of categorize. All these impacts, they interact and cascade into each other, and the dichotomy between the economic and non-economic is perhaps more ambiguous and complicated than often portrayed. Also, the question of what does addressing losses and damages mean, and I'm also happy to get into this in the Q&A. It has no clear answer. UNDRR, for example, disaster risk reduction are now involved, and they talk a lot about early warning systems, but we would say early warning systems are perhaps adaptation. And lastly, there's little evidence of what is needed to address non-economic losses and damages, though still, this is quite a research gap. So these are the 3 papers basically that I've used for this presentation. I'll hopefully send a presentation through at some point so you can see them. Also good to know that the interview you saw is part of a bigger video that we did with multiple interviews from people that you can find on YouTube, which is called A Story on Loss and Damage in Bangladesh. And these are the references, and thereby, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and also for putting the focus on the experience of loss and damage, really moving a little bit away from the frameworks and how it feels like and how it can be addressed. That was excellent. So now it's time for our Q&A, and I thought we'd start with a question for Elisa from Connie. The question is, given that the current loss and damage fund as established under the UNFCCC does not include state liability, and therefore there are no remedies per se, what is the difference in the nature of this fund and the other mitigation and adaptation funds?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's a really important question, and in a way, it's part of a broader conundrum. And I think particularly what also Ida was mentioning earlier around this new controversy around whether the loss and damage fund is part of the collective quantified goal on climate finance just shows that I think there's some important conceptual and legal distinctions that should be made but are not being made under the regime. I mean, in some ways, if the loss and damage fund is not remedy and compensation, then it is a form of climate finance. But the question is, well, is it the same part of the same obligations on financial solidarity? And again, I think even there we have different states who would argue whether these are obligations or how stringent an obligation. I'm quite keen to refer again to the advisory opinion of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. They really clarified that, you know, the first of all, financial solidarity obligations are not only found under the Paris Agreement and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, but they're also found in other relevant international treaties, such as the Convention on the Law of the Sea. And in that case, the tribunal noted that these are binding obligation of cooperation. So I think there's a series of questions of, you know, the legal nature of the obligations, going back to the relevant treaties, and then how these are then maybe how things are, the waters are murked once we have these more operational decisions are being taken. And I guess I don't have a quick answer just now. This is certainly a question that I will study carefully in my own mandate. And I think many other also special procedures and possibly treaty bodies will be offering their views on this. But it really shows maybe the point that, you know, really shows the importance of the point that Ida made around where do we need to pay attention to and where we need to focus advocacy efforts. And that work at the board level, at the, you know, more nitty-gritty details of, you know, how we understand gaps, how we understand where the funding is coming from, how we assess whether the funding is sufficient, and all of that are part of that, being able to answer that question or understanding the gap between international obligations, how they're interpreted and operationalized in a particular regime, but also how we can still have that conversation outside of the regime under other international law structures. So both having that detailed insight from the inner workings of the Loss and Damage Fund and other structures within the international climate regime, but also not necessarily being confined there, as those states who are part of those international treaties are also party to other relevant and applicable international treaties that can clarify and show that there are obligations that go above and beyond what may be agreed and maybe, you know, politically possible in the context of the Paris Agreement. So sorry, it's only a partial answer. I'll need to work more on this for sure, but I think it is a really important point to, I think it gives an indication that maybe states are trying to avoid that clarity on their obligations in terms of finance and in terms of reparation.
Thank you. I will now pass over to Save the Children's global lead on climate advocacy, Jack Wakefield, to answer some of the questions that have been put here.
No, thanks so much, Martina. I first wanted to come in on Christoph's question on the relationship between humanitarian responses dealing with climate events and loss and damage finance and the kind of interrelationship there, because I think that's an important one. And I think that the first thing to say is that, you know, new and additional loss and damage financing should complement humanitarian funding, but it obviously has a broader scope than current humanitarian funding and needs to be structured in a different way, recognizing that humanitarian assistance alone is not sufficient to address climate-related loss and damage. I mean, in terms of some of the key points on this, I think, first of all, as others have mentioned, you know, securing new and additional funding rather than simply relabeling existing humanitarian funding to address loss and damage caused by humanitarian crisis is key. We know that UN coordinated appeals are really poorly funding and really poorly funded, so relying on humanitarian funding alone is not sufficient to address loss and damage. We also know that loss and damage funding needs to have a different basis to humanitarian funding, and that quite often the current humanitarian funding system lacks the sustainability, the predictability, accessibility and adequacy needed to meet some of these challenges. I think we also need to develop mechanisms and, you know, operationalize this loss and damage funding in highly fragile and conflict affected states. This can draw from humanitarian experience, you know, and we need funding approaches that are designed to tolerate risk and involve a range of diverse actors beyond government ministries and that obviously avoid exacerbating conflicts. And that also the loss and damage fund needs to be designed with the aim of enabling locally led organisations to access the funding, that it could potentially adopt the principles of locally led adaptation and consider things in that regard. And we also need to ensure that loss and damage funding is available in situations where climate change interacts with other challenges, be that conflict, economic shocks, or displacement. I mean, I think critically, we need to see a kind of breaking down of some of the silos between these different funding mechanisms, between climate finance, humanitarian finance, and development finance. I hope that's helpful. And then on Vigar's question on how confident are we that the loss and damage fund is going to be able to mobilize finance fast and at the scale necessary. I mean, the honest answer is at the moment, we're not sure. Obviously, the board is still going through some of these key questions in the coming months. But what we know, obviously, and parties, keep raising this, speed is of the essence. And the loss and damage fund certainly needs to take lessons from other funding mechanisms on what works best, but also in particular on what doesn't work well. So, the slow processes associated with the GCF, for example, shouldn't be the model for this fund. And again, linked to the previous question, there are a lot of lessons to be taken from the humanitarian sector that will be useful here as well. On the question of scale, I mean, honestly, it's not looking great. After COP28, we saw under $800 million pledged against loss and damage funds needs, and obviously the needs for loss and damage before too long are going to enter the trillions. That's why it's so important for us as a child rights community and civil society and beyond to keep the pressure up on parties and other key stakeholders in this process, including getting formal recognition of loss and damage as the third formal pillar of climate action, and recognition of this in negotiations around the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, which are due to conclude at COP29 in Baku this year, but are obviously happening in quite bad faith at the moment. And we need these different component pieces to come together if we're going to see the enormous needs in terms of loss and damage met. Thanks, Martina.
Thank you, Jack. And now I have another question for Dawe about the non-economic loss and damage from Connie again. Thus, categorizing some loss and damage as non-economic gives state like a possibility to not finance some of that, and if not, then what do you see as the purpose of classifying some losses as non-economic?
Yeah, I've wondered about this as well. And that's also why in the research we kind of look at these boundaries between the economic and non-economic, and also show that the non-economic losses and damages that people experience have significant economic costs. I think the purpose of non-economic loss and damage being there, and I think it really has served a purpose, even though it's very flawed as a concept, I think, is showing that there are significant cultural losses and mental health and health losses that people experience, and that we're not only talking about infrastructure and housing, for example. And I agree. I don't think necessarily at the moment it's completely weaponized to reduce that amount of finance that countries want to mobilize. Perhaps I think during one of the DC meetings, the US at some point proposed that the fund should only look at non-economic loss and damage, but I don't think anyone really took this serious. And I think that maybe like one intervention and that was it. So I don't think at the negotiations it's being weaponized, but I do see the problem. To keep non-economic completely economic and not see that health impacts have significant economic costs, for example, and education impacts as well. Yeah, I hope that's a satisfactory answer.
Yeah, and maybe following up on that, a question from Madit about how to kind of monitorize these non-economic losses, how to compensate for them. What are the discussions around that? Obviously, there are probably no easy answers, but...
Yeah, I think as long as I've been working on this, people are asking to quantify losses, non-economic losses and damages. But this is also a very risky territory, because then you're talking about rituals and religious practices that you're trying to put in economic terms and kind of to quantify in this kind of capitalist Western model, which is not necessarily what you want to do, but then also you want them to be adequately captured and taken into the negotiations. So I think it's a discussion that a lot of people are having, and I don't think people are figuring it out. At least I haven't seen research that has really tackled this question. But I would argue, again, like this is just a research gap or just a gap in the discussion that we're having right now, because we're not monetizing non-economic losses at the moment, as far as I know.
Yeah, Elisa, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sorry, just to complement, I think, I mean, an interesting underlying question is what areas of research are the experts in the loss and damage fund relying on? Because of course we have other areas of research on human rights budgeting, on ecosystem services valuation and benefits of nature to human well-being, which have done extensive work on not necessarily monetizing, but definitely valuing. And, you know, there seems to be maybe a lack of engagement and misrecognition of that work that contributes to that all the dichotomies that arise from the economic and non-economic loss and damage. So I think that there's an element there. And again, I go back to that, the importance of how the General Comment 26 has in spelling out the substantive content of children's human rights to a healthy environment, to really show the areas of expertise that we need to engage to challenge those conversations, but also provide relevant evidence and best science to show, I think, as you know, Dowie has shown like the linkages, the knock-on effects of one loss and damage over other. And there's very clear studies, you know, even from the health community around economic savings as opposed to economic losses related to the breaking down of either health services or actual health conditions. And that might be a way, not the only way, but I think a way also to engage with the cultural dimensions. So yeah, definitely I think there's areas of science and communities of practice that can be engaged to help, I think, challenge some of the assumptions which seem to be based on a much narrower set of areas of research and understanding in this context.
Yeah, thanks for complimenting. That was really useful. There's a question from Inda about operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund, and I'll hand over to Ida to answer that.
Yes, thank you. So on where they are with the Loss and Damage Fund right now is that with many other funds as well, there's a lot of technical kind of bureaucratic nitty-gritty elements that need to be put in place. Who's going to be the executive director? Where is the board going to have their kind of legal host country? Where is the headquarters for the secretariat going to be? There are a lot of questions that are not related to the actual funds and the allocation of the funds that are being discussed right now, which makes it less clear to understand some of the important answers to the questions that we're all waiting for and looking for. For example, who is going to ensure, like, how are we going to ensure that there's a equitable allocation of funds? How are we going to ensure that the funding is trigger-based when needed, etc.? So these decisions are a bit further into the year, likely. Also discussions on how, which kind of projects is the fund going to finance, because that's also very up in the air. So the main question of substance, I would say right now, is that question about how the World Bank can contribute to ensure direct access, because they're a bit unsure about that, as well as how non-party stakeholders can get involved in the work of the fund. But when it comes to one of the questions that Inda asked on if there are strategic contributions from civil society right now at this stage of the talks, I would say definitely yes. I think it's important to engage also outside of the negotiations, but concretely with the board members already on talking to them about our asks and needs to integrate child rights and target children with these funds, because these discussions are going to come up soon. And then we need to have kind of board members ready and on board, and that they have an understanding of the agenda and what we're trying to achieve before they suddenly have to make a decision and suddenly will develop the guidelines. So I think also using the expert dialogue on climate and children that just happened in Bonn as the first ever mandated event under the UNFCCC on the disproportionate impacts on children. There's several parties asked for the mainstreaming of child rights into several negotiation tracks, and that also includes loss and damage. So I would advise to use that as kind of leverage to say that parties are asking for this. We need to start talking about how the fund can target children and, of course, other groups that are vulnerable to climate change already, even though they are discussing kind of nitty-gritty bureaucratic pieces within the board meetings right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Ida. And there are many other good questions in the chat, but we're running out of time. So the remaining questions we'll answer in writing and share with you afterwards. And so now I'd like to hand over to Jack Wakefield, our Global Climate Advocacy Lead, for some closing words and what we should take away from this. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much. I mean, first of all, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone here for joining, and to all our brilliant speakers for so clearly articulating why loss and damage is such a significant issue for the world's children, and what shape a meaningful child rights approach to addressing loss and damage should take. And to thank Dowie and Elisa in particular for sticking around for the full session to answer questions. That's greatly appreciated. I know how busy you both are. As our speakers have highlighted, loss and damage is one of the great intergenerational ills that children face, and it's really essential now that parties and board members of the new Loss and Damage Fund utilise the Convention on the Rights of the Child and General Comment 26 as guiding lights in the pursuit of climate justice, and that children are given a seat at the table as experts on their own lives. Last year, Save the Children and UNICEF ran a series of consultations with children aged between 11 and 18 on what they want to see from the new Loss and Damage Fund. And on this point, George from Zambia noted that it's very important for children to participate in the decision making when it comes to loss and damage, because the children themselves are experiencing it firsthand. If we only have leaders at the top deciding everything about the Loss and Damage Fund and how the fund should be spent, then they won't fully understand how children are experiencing loss and damage. And I think we can all agree it's so important that policymakers hear from voices like George. In October of last year, the climate movement as a whole lost an absolute titan with the passing of Professor Salim al-Haq. He was one of the most effective and unrelenting advocates for loss and damage financing, and was a great supporter of children and young people having a meaningful voice in global climate negotiations. In the last conversation I had with him, he decried the global inaction on this issue and suggested that we shouldn't be moving towards COP28 or COP29, but instead we should be resetting the process and be heading towards COP1, the first COP in the era of rampant loss and damage. So for the sake of the 2.4 billion children across the globe, this community really mustn't falter in our commitment to ensure that loss and damage finance works for all children, particularly those on the front lines of this crisis. Thank you again, everyone here, and to our speakers for your time. And I hope together we can take these recommendations and these positive discussions forward into the tangible action we so urgently need to see. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Jack, and thanks for everyone's engagement in the chat and the Q&A. It's great to see that there's such interest in these questions, and I think you've brought up all these issues that we will keep working with and informing you about in the different working groups. So thanks a lot. We will share the presentations with you later and send out the recording, and talk to you very soon. Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks and bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.